The field was wide open. There was no shelter. Northwest trees close enough to reach. No wall to get behind. Just flat, brown French earth stretching ahead, and somewhere across it, hidden in the shadows of a broken farmhouse, a German machine gun was already spinning. The American soldiers standing at the edge of that field in the summer of 1944 were young men. Most of them were in their early 20s. Some were even younger. They came from small towns and big cities across the United States. They had never seen anything like this before in their lives. And what they were about to do went against every natural feeling inside a human body. They ran forward. Straight into the fire. This is not a story about men who had no fear. They had enormous fear. Their hands shook. Their mouths went dry. Some of them prayed quietly as they moved. This is a story about why they kept going anyway, and the hard, real reason behind it that most people have never fully understood. Sergeant John Allgood had already survived Omaha Beach by the time the summer was over. He was a quiet man from Georgia who had grown up working on his family's farm. He was not the kind of person who talked much about himself, but he remembered everything about that day with perfect and painful clarity. On the morning of June 6, 1944, Allgood's landing craft opened its metal ramp and dropped him into water that was chest deep. Men were falling around him before he even reached the sand. The German positions up on the bluffs above Omaha Beach had every inch of that shoreline covered. The machine guns did not stop. They almost never stopped. What happened next was something that confused historians and military writers for many years afterward. The men who lay down on the beach and stayed still, the ones who flattened themselves behind obstacles or pressed themselves into the sand, died in very large numbers. But the men who got up and ran forward, despite everything their bodies were screaming at them, had a better chance of surviving. This sounds completely backwards. Every human instinct says that when someone is shooting at you, you get as low as possible and you stay there. You hide. You wait. You protect yourself. But the battlefield does not care about human instinct. The battlefield has its own terrible logic. And on Omaha Beach, that logic was merciless. The German machine gun of the era, the weapon they called the MG-42, could fire more than 1,200 rounds per minute. That is 20 rounds every single second. It was so fast that soldiers said it did not sound like individual shots. It sounded like a long, tearing sheet of noise, like fabric being ripped apart very quickly. The Germans called it many things. The Americans, when they talked about it at all, called it the buzz saw. A man lying still on an open beach was the perfect target for that weapon. The gunner could find him, hold the aim steady, and the result was certain. But a man running forward, zigzagging, moving fast and unpredictably. The gunner had to track him. Had to lead the movement. Had to guess where the running figure would be in the next half second. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, he guessed wrong. Allgood understood this not as a thought but as a feeling in his body. Something in his training had rewired him. He got up and he moved forward. He lost friends that morning. He saw things he would carry with him for the rest of his life. But he reached the base of the bluff. And eventually, he reached the top. Private Raymond Grimes had a very different kind of war. He arrived in Europe later, in the autumn of 1944, and he found himself assigned to the 28th Infantry Division at one of the most difficult places American soldiers fought in the entire war, the Hurtgen Forest in western Germany. The Hurtgen was nothing like Normandy. It was dense, dark woodland with tall trees that blocked the sky. The German army had been preparing those woods for months. They had placed their defensive positions with great care, using the trees and the steep ground to create overlapping fields of fire. Almost every open path between the trees was watched. Almost every clearing was targeted. Grimes was a thin young man from Ohio who had wanted to be a schoolteacher before the war interrupted his plans. He wrote letters home to his mother almost every week, though he never told her the real details of what he was living through. He did not want her to worry more than she already did. In the Hurtgen, his squad moved through the trees using something called fire and movement. It was the central tactical method of the American infantry, and it was built on a simple but demanding idea. When you need to move across ground that is covered by the enemy, you do not all move at once. Half of you lay down fire toward the enemy position. That means you shoot at where they are, not necessarily to score a direct hit, but to force their heads down. To make them duck. To interrupt their aim. While the first half is firing, the other half runs. They sprint forward to the next covered position, a tree, a dip in the ground, a collapsed wall. Then they stop. They turn. They begin firing. And now the first group gets up and moves forward past them. This goes on until you reach the enemy position or until the situation changes. It sounds straightforward when you describe it calmly. It is not straightforward when you are the one running. Grimes later described what it felt like to be the moving man. His squad mate, a big Polish-American from Chicago named Kowalski, would be shooting as fast as he could into the tree line ahead. Grimes would take a breath. Then he would get up and sprint, keeping as low as possible, pumping his legs as hard as they would go, not looking at anything except the next tree he was trying to reach. The sound was overwhelming. The noise of his own side firing, the sound of return fire from the Germans, the crashing of branches, the cold air cutting into his face as he ran, all of it blurred together into something that did not feel real. He said it was like running through a very bad dream where your body feels both too slow and somehow disconnected from your mind. But here is what he also said, and this is important: while he was running, he trusted Kowalski completely. Not because he had any proof in that moment that Kowalski was doing his job, but because they had trained together for months. Because he had seen Kowalski stay steady under pressure before. Because the whole system required that level of trust, and without it, the system did not work and both men would die. This is one of the real reasons American soldiers kept advancing. It was not blind courage. It was a deeply human thing. They kept moving because the man next to them was depending on them to move. And they kept firing because the man next to them was depending on them to fire. The tactical doctrine of fire and movement worked because it converted individual fear into collective action. It turned the survival of each person into the responsibility of the group. None of this happened by accident. Long before these men ever reached Europe, the United States Army had worked very hard to prepare them for exactly this kind of moment. The military had studied the experience of the First World War carefully. They had looked at what made soldiers freeze under fire. They had tried to understand why, in many engagements, a significant number of soldiers never fired their weapons at all, not because they were cowards, but because fear had locked their bodies in place and overwhelmed their ability to act. The answer the Army came up with was systematic and deliberate. You cannot prepare a man for the experience of real combat by reading him instructions or showing him a map. You have to put his body through something close enough to the real thing that, when the real thing arrives, his body already knows what to do. At training camps across the United States, soldiers went through live-fire exercises. This meant they crawled through mud while real machine gun rounds passed just 18 inches above their heads. It meant explosions went off nearby while they were moving. It meant they were exhausted, cold, disoriented, and under pressure, and they still had to complete their objectives. The lesson was not about removing fear. Fear cannot be removed. What the training did was teach men to function alongside their fear. To take the next step even when every feeling in their body was pushing against it. The goal was simple but very hard to achieve: make the required action feel more automatic than the instinct to stop. Sergeant Allgood once said that when he got up and ran on Omaha Beach, he did not make a decision in the way a person makes a decision while sitting quietly at a table. He said his body simply moved, and his mind came along with it afterward. The training had installed something into his reflexes that went deeper than conscious thought. That is exactly what the Army had intended. And for many soldiers, in many terrible situations across the European theater of the war, it worked. Lieutenant Harold Linebaugh commanded a rifle company during the winter campaigns of 1944 and 1945, some of the hardest fighting American forces faced in the final months of the war in Europe. He was a careful, observant man, and decades later he sat down and wrote one of the most honest accounts of infantry combat from the American perspective. Linebaugh's book, written with his fellow officer John Campbell, is a quiet and powerful document. It does not glorify the war. It does not make the men into heroes in the simple, dramatic sense that movies often use. Instead, it describes what it was actually like to be inside a rifle company moving through a defended countryside in the middle of winter. One thing Linebaugh returned to again and again was the nature of courage as he had actually witnessed it. He was very clear on this point. He said that the men who fought well, who kept moving when they needed to move, who did not freeze in the moments when freezing would have ended everything, were not, for the most part, men who felt no fear. They were men who had been trained and conditioned to act regardless of what they felt. He also described something that is harder to talk about. He described what it cost. After days and weeks of combat, men changed. The constant pressure of having to override your own survival instincts, of being required to move toward danger rather than away from it, of watching friends fall and then continuing the advance anyway, this created a kind of exhaustion that went much deeper than physical tiredness. Military doctors attached to the divisions called it battle fatigue. Today we would understand it as a serious psychological wound. Linebaugh wrote about sitting down with his men after a particularly hard engagement and looking at their faces. They were not celebrating. They were not proud in any obvious way. They were simply very, very tired. Some of them stared at nothing. Some of them ate their food mechanically, without tasting it. The young men who had left their homes less than a year earlier had become people who had seen and done things that no amount of civilian life could have prepared them for. And yet, Linebaugh insisted on something important. He said that these men had not lost themselves. They had, in fact, found a version of themselves that they never would have discovered any other way. They had learned what they were truly capable of, which is a kind of knowledge that sits in a person very differently from any knowledge they can gain from a book or a classroom. He was also honest about the limits of that knowledge. He said that he did not fully understand what he had been through until the war was over. For a long time, the experience sat inside him, too large and too strange to fully see. He needed distance from it before he could begin to describe it clearly. So here is the answer to the question that opens this story. Here is why American soldiers kept advancing into German fire without taking cover. It was not because they were fearless. They were not. It was not because they did not understand the danger. They understood it completely, sometimes more completely than they wanted to. The first reason was mathematical. In open ground, under automatic weapons fire, a stationary target is far easier to hit than a moving one. Staying still was often not the safer choice. It only felt like the safer choice because hiding feels safer than running. But feeling and reality are not always the same thing, and in combat the cost of confusing them is final. The second reason was tactical. Fire and movement worked. It was not a perfect system, and it did not guarantee survival for any individual soldier. But it gave the group the best available chance of accomplishing the mission and protecting as many lives as possible. It was the result of careful study and hard experience, and when it was executed well, it could move men across ground that seemed completely impossible to cross. The third reason was human. These men were not fighting for abstract ideas in the moments when it mattered most. They were fighting for the specific person standing or running next to them. The bonds formed between soldiers during training and combat are among the strongest bonds that human beings can form. The thought of failing the person beside you, of stopping when they needed you to keep going, was often more powerful than the fear of what lay ahead. And the fourth reason was training. The United States Army had systematically prepared these men to perform under the exact conditions they were experiencing. It had not prepared them to feel comfortable. Nothing could do that. But it had prepared them to act correctly even when comfort was entirely absent. Raymond Grimes came home from the Hurtgen Forest. He did eventually become a schoolteacher, just as he had always planned, and he taught history to high school students for over 30 years. His students did not know, for the most part, that their calm, patient teacher had once sprinted through a German forest while the world came apart around him. John Allgood returned to his family's farm in Georgia. He was a man of very few words about the war. His children knew that he had been at Omaha Beach because they had heard it mentioned once or twice, but he never described it in any detail. He kept those memories private and carried them quietly for the rest of his long life. Harold Linebaugh wrote it all down. He felt that someone had to. He believed that the story of ordinary young men placed into extraordinary and terrible circumstances was a story worth preserving, not to celebrate war, but to honestly record what human beings are capable of when everything is required of them. He ended his book with a sentence that stayed with his readers long after they finished the last page. He wrote that his men had been through something they did not fully understand and could not fully explain. He said that after many years, they still could not. That honesty is, in its own way, a kind of courage too. The courage to say that some experiences are larger than the words available to describe them. That some things a person lives through remain mysterious even to the person who lived through them. The soldiers who crossed those open fields and kept moving despite everything did not do so because they had solved the mystery of fear. They did it because the army, and their comrades, and the cold arithmetic of survival had given them something stronger than fear to act on. They kept moving. And some of them made it home. End of story.